All right, I'm very honored to be back emceeing the conference. I think I've been to 24 of these in one form or another, and I always like being here. I feel sorry for the few years that I've missed, and I want to help out in any way I can, so I'm very thrilled to be back. The first thing that I would like to do today is I want to bring up Jerry Blackburn to the stage. Jerry, come on up. Jerry is a lifelong friend of Lou Farish's, and is now the trustee of the Lou Farish Research and Education Fund. And so we're going to kick off the business today with Jerry is going to award this year's recipient of the Lou Farish Award. So Jerry, okay, your mic, Jesse.
Before I start, I want to add my thanks to Julia and her family for carrying on the tradition that Lou started so many years ago. And having Forrest back is like old times. Many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you attended one of the conferences that was directed by Lou? Would you raise your hand? Okay, quite a few, but a lot of you didn't get a chance to know Lou, and I'm going to say just a couple words about him before we present this year's Lou Farish Award. Lou's full name was Lucius O. Farish, but he always went by Lou. He was director of the conference for, I can't remember if it's 20 or 22 years, a long, long time. I got to know Lou back in the 70s as we were both involved in an abductee regression, and got to become good friends with him, worked with him over the years. We had an Arkansas UFO discussion group in the Little Rock area that met about quarterly. Then I also helped him with computer-related matters in the conference for about 20-something years. Lou was one of the most interesting people I've ever met, and I considered him one of my best friends, and many of you who knew him would probably say exactly the same thing. He was really smart. When he died of melanoma in 2012, and while he was in hospice, many people came by to see him, and also emailed him and sent messages to him, but one of his lifelong friends came by and told me that Lou could read a newspaper when he started first grade. He was just a really smart guy. They said he was always seen with a book under his arm. He had a huge library that he donated after he passed away to Dave Marler. Took him almost 2 U-Haul trucks to move it all. But he was very well read. He could talk to anybody about anything. He had an encyclopedic memory for UFO-related incidents. Another thing that he did was, for about 20 years, he was the editor, co-editor, then editor of the UFO news clipping service. Back before the internet, this was the main way people could find out about UFO sightings. And it was a huge service, and he developed corresponded with his subscribers all over the world. He had a huge list of people that he kept in touch with all over the world. When Lou passed away, he never married, never had any children, no close relatives. And he decided he wanted to leave his modest estate to be used for UFO research and education. And he asked if I would be the trustee, and I agreed to do that. So we set up the Lucius O. Farish Research and Education Trust before he died. And you can go and read about Lou's life and the resources that are available there at www.farishtrust.org. Or you could email me at trustee@farishtrust.org. Basically, the 4 things the trust was set up to do was to provide mini grants of $500 to $5,000 for people who needed seed money to do things related to UFO research and education. It might be analyzing a white powder found in a crop circle, analyzing tree rings right near where a famous UFO sighting took place. Those types of things. It might involve camera equipment, night vision equipment for people who are doing research. So a wide variety of things that we've given many grants for. Also, made provision for graduate fellowships for graduate students who are writing a thesis or dissertation on a UFO-related topic. So far, we haven't had any takers on that. So if any of you know anyone who's doing that, please have them get in touch with me. Unfortunately, in academia, that's still something they don't touch with a 10-foot pole. And Lou wanted to encourage people to do that. But if you ever expect to get tenure in academia, you don't want on your dissertation topic to be UFO related, unfortunately. Anyway, that was his purpose. He also liked to bring, as many of you remember, loved to bring in international speakers to this conference. And so he provided some money to be used for that. And finally, he wanted to recognize or give credit to people who've made unusual contributions to ufology, to UFO research or education, and set aside $1,000 a year for an award to some person. And basically the way we picked this person is we have a list of 60 or 70 what I call the Friends of Lou email list. Some of you are on it probably. People who cared enough about him to write him a message while he was in hospice or that I knew he corresponded with regularly. And we get suggestions from them and narrow it down to one person each year. The first two recipients were Linda Moulton Howe and Richard Dolan, and both of them are speakers this year. Linda and Richard, are you in the audience? Not yet, okay. Anyway, we're about to announce the third recipient. This year's recipient has many similarities to Lou, surprising as I started researching him. He had a lifelong interest, or nearly lifelong interest in UFOs, dedicated most of his adult life to researching UFOs, never married or had children. He saw a need to collect high-quality UFO reports and make them available to the public in as accurate a way as possible. And he did that through both the UFO News Clipping Service and also through the conference. So those were things that he dedicated most of his life to. And this year's recipient also has done that. He supported his own, like Lou, has supported his work mostly from his own pocket. And I'm pleased to announce this year's recipient, Peter Davenport. He doesn't know this yet. Peter, would you come on up? I almost hate to do this to somebody right before they're going to give a talk.
Boy, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jerry. I'm shocked, I'm delighted, I'm surprised. You've conspired against me, but I'm delighted you conspired against me. This is the highest honor I've had in 21 years.
Well, thank you. I'm going to,
I'm going to leave it right there.
Okay, and there's a box for it right over there in case I forget to give it to you. I'm going to borrow Peter a minute to take a couple more pictures while he composes himself. And Forrest is going to say a few more words. But I'm delighted to make this award. He's certainly deserving of it. I want to say one more thing. In addition to the thousands, it's I think close to 90,000 reports that you've received. Actually, I missed a couple of slides here. Let me just a second. Forgot this. Peter is the director of the National UFO Reporting Service. A lot of this is in your program. It's a 24-hour hotline. They've received something like 90,000 sightings. They're available, most of them, I believe, online through the. You can do searches by state, by type, triangular, circular, so forth. He's a frequent guest on the Jeff Rentz and Coast to Coast radio programs, bringing public up to date with the latest sightings. Again, like Lou, has also served as Director of Investigation for Washington State MUFON chapter. He's spoken at many UFO conferences. I think you had your first sighting at age 6, I believe.
6.5.
I'm probably stealing some of the thunder from your talk here.
In
but-
St. Louis,
St.
by
Louis,
the way.
right?
My hometown.
Another interesting thing is as I understand, your first investigation of a UFO sighting was in Exeter, New Hampshire in 1965. It also happened to be my first investigation. We were living in Boston, and my wife and I went up and interviewed some people in 1966. That was a famous case, the Incident at Exeter book by John Fuller.
Yep.
A couple of comments in the Seattle Weekly about Peter. The UFO Reporting Center is known worldwide among UFO enthusiasts as it is among law enforcement agencies, 911 emergency dispatch centers. This is the number that they give to anybody who calls in with a UFO report. A one-man operation, Davenport, 63, never married, had no children. This was written 2 or 3 years ago, not 2011. Works almost every day from wake up to lights out, fully funds the hotline out of his own pocket. Known for his deep interest in science and his encyclopedic memory, like Lou, in recounting dates, times, locations, and even the most arcane details of sight. Davenport's highly respected among peers, has an excellent reputation. He's top flight and extremely intelligent, declares Clifford Clift, director of MUFON. So again, a couple other things. He has undergraduate degrees from Stanford in Russian and biology, and MS and MBA degrees from University of Washington. Had a whole slew of really interesting jobs working in Russia and other places. Founded and sold a Seattle-based biotechnology company. Was candidate for Washington legislature and also the U.S. Congress. One of the things that I really wanted to say was that in addition to the scientific value of all these sightings, one of the, to me, almost equally important is the service you provide to people who are afraid to talk about UFOs, especially in small towns. We had an evangelist a few years ago who was almost ran for president, who said that anyone who believed in UFOs should be stoned to death. If you live in a small town with that kind of mentality that UFOs are the work of the devil or whatever, or if you're afraid of losing your job or even afraid of not getting a promotion, frequently there is no one you can talk to except calling Peter Davenport. So that providing a psychologically safe place for people all over the country, maybe all over the world, to report a UFO sighting, to me, is almost one of the most important reasons for this award. So thanks again for doing that.
Boy, thank you very, very much.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of pictures and we'll be back up.
You're not done with me yet. I'm coming back. As much as you wish you were.
Yeah. Let me take this computer.
Oh,
Need that?
We'll let them unplug it.
Oh, okay. All right, well, they're doing Hollywood over here with the recipient award pictures and stuff like that. I want to tell you a little bit more about Peter also. Even Jerry did a fantastic job of going over his credentials. But to back up what he's saying, if we go back in time a little bit with the UFO phenomenon and with organizations like MUFON and NICAP and APRO and all the independent groups that have been investigating UFOs over the years, there was a time when all of those organizations had their own reporting structures. And so if you called in a UFO sighting, you know, if you liked MUFON, you called MUFON. If you liked APRO, you called, and in a lot of cases it was whoever you were exposed to or whoever you knew about. And there was no continuity across these groups. Well, that doesn't make for good information sharing or good science. Over the years, the groups started slowly, you know, forming up where if MUFON got a report, they would also share it with NICAP and that sort of thing. But what Peter has done, and what he hit, like I say, this is a devotion, and it's one of these things that gets in you, and I'm sure it goes all the way back to when you saw your UFO whenever you were little. A lot of us had this same experience, myself included. You know, how'd you get started? Well, I saw something. It changes you very, very fundamentally. Even if it's just something weird going across the sky. Your brain twists and it turns and it has to restructure. And in that process, you become inherently curious. And you get this lifetime devotion to this phenomenon that takes you over. And the service that Peter has is literally, there's probably nowhere in the world, certainly not in North America, that you could call in a UFO report to any agency. And this is military, military bases, law enforcement, anything like that, where they're not going to relay you to him. So now there's this central repository where all the information can flow through, it can be studied, and it can be gathered and disseminated to the researchers. It is an invaluable service that exists to our science. Okay, so we have come a long way, and I've said this before, that we are getting into very exciting times in the field of ufology right now. We go through, it kind of ebbs and flows. We had a number of years there where it didn't seem like there was much going on. But if you look across the history of us studying this phenomenon, we've reached these tipping points in our knowledge, but we've also reached tipping points in the general public's understanding and acceptance of this information. When I first started doing this whenever I was a teenager, you would spend most of your time just trying to convince people that UFOs were real. Well, now, the whole general population is at a different level of understanding of this phenomenon, and they want more and more information. We're in the information age, for God's sakes. Every one of us has got one of the most powerful computers ever made in our pocket, more than likely, and if you don't own an iPhone, get one, okay? You Android people, I don't want to talk to you. No, okay. Point taken. We're at a point now where things are starting to get exciting again. If you remember, if you go back to the early 90s, television programs started popping up, right? We got more media, and then when we got to the new millennium, we hit 2000, the information media has exploded. And what has happened is you have not seen a decrease in the interest in UFO shows, even during the times when we weren't seeing a lot of activity. New shows out now, with Ancient Aliens, for God's sakes. How many years are we in now? It keeps going. Giorgio with the hair. Do you know that he makes as much fun of his hair as we do? He does. He was going to be here a couple years ago and had to cancel. It was when I was emceeing then. I wanted so bad to mess his hair up. Okay. But that show is phenomenal success. People on there that we all know. Okay. Ancient Aliens, Hangar 1. Who's watching Hangar 1? Oh, if you're not, start watching Hangar 1. And let's have a little fun this weekend. I'm going to invite you to do this. Every time the program Hangar 1 is mentioned, everybody go MUFON. Okay? I'm serious. This is so exciting. The organization, Walt has got to be beside himself. This is fantastic to have a show so well done where we're pulling stuff out of the files. We're finally starting to look and analyze that information because the public wants to hear it. Okay? And this is very, very exciting times. So, where did Peter go? All right. All right, so this weekend, you're going to be exposed to a lot of fantastic information, lots of new information, okay? Things have been happening in the field, and we're going to kick this off with Peter Davenport.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Jerry and Forrest and Julia. Boy, how to upset a tightly prepared presentation what better way than by presenting the type of award that I just received. That was a shock. They're very tight-lipped. They did very well. I can't tell you how flattering it is. I can't tell you how delightful it is to appear before all of you. Thank you one and all for taking the time and trouble and a little bit of your treasury to be here for this conference. I am delighted to be here, and I think I have a presentation that you will find very, very interesting. I am Peter Davenport. As you've already heard, I'm director of the National UFO Reporting Center, and I should give credit to the gentleman who really started this operation. It should be he who should have received this award, Robert J. Gribble. In the summer of 1974, so 41 years ago, he was involved with MUFON. He was very interested in UFOs. He had just retired from the Seattle Fire Department, and he argued that what we needed, once we had a modern telephone system, what we really needed was one telephone number in the United States where if a person saw a UFO anywhere across the country, they could call that number, they could tell their story, the data would be preserved, and it would be made, most of all, it would be made available to the public, to you, ladies and gentlemen, who deserve this information. You are the ones who own this information. That is my philosophy, and that's the philosophy that guides my work. I apologize for the delay here. We just had to set up a few things. In any event, it's high honor to have the opportunity to appear before all of you. And one thing, a few comments were made by Forrest and by Jerry. There are really several very, very good UFO organizations who do something similar to what I do. I feel duty-bound to share with you that the fact, my recognition that MUFON does every bit the job that I do. We're just a little bit different. We just go in slightly different directions, few differences between our operations, but they do an excellent job, and I can't take all the credit because I know how hard many of those people work, and there are others. There are people in Canada, Brian Vike, there's UFO BC, Chris Rutkowski, who does an annual summary of all the sightings in Canada. Many of our sightings I transport to him so he can include them in his annual summary, and many, many others. But I am dedicated to the field, and one of the things that makes it so pleasurable for me to be at this conference is I'm a show-me stater. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. I was born the 11th of, yeah. Boy, it's wonderful to be back to the Midwest, isn't it? I had a wonderful childhood. Part of that childhood, as Jerry mentioned to you, was a very dramatic sighting in St. Louis, Missouri, over the St. Louis Airport, Lambert Field. I was a lad of 6.5. We think it was July 17th of 1954. We were sitting in our family car, a 1953 Studebaker with that chrome ring on the front of it. Some of you look to be old enough to remember what a 53 Studebaker looked like. I'm delighted to see a lot of young faces here too. Of course, that applies to all of us. But I think I can honestly report to you that the reason I am standing before you here today, the reason I received this wonderful and deeply flattering award is because of that sighting that lasted about 5 or 10 seconds in July of 1954. I was seated in the right-hand seat of that 53 Studebaker, and we saw a doozy of an object. Its apparent size equal to that of the moon in the night sky, so a very prominent object. It was blood red, the color of a red traffic signal, and it suddenly accelerated, and it went from there to gone over McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in about 2 seconds, following an S curve across the sky. That's what I saw. I remember it as clearly today as I would had it happened last night. Well, let me get into this presentation. I've got a lot of material. Could I ask with a show of hands, how many people were here at this conference 4 years ago and saw me speak in 2000? Quite a number. Okay. I ask because that will cause me to shift the emphasis of my presentation a little bit. You'll see some familiar slides that you may recall, but don't despair. I've got a lot of new material, some very, very interesting stuff. Well, I titled my talk, My 50 Years of UFO Investigation, and the reason for that is, as Jerry mentioned, we had a doozy of a sighting up in Exeter, New Hampshire. I mean, it wasn't just one sighting, it was several sightings, and I'm going to That will be my closing remark, trying to explain why there were several sightings in New Hampshire in 1965. I think I may be the only person on this planet who understands why those sightings were taking place. And I'm going to be talking about strange coincidences during my presentation. And if I marshal my time correctly, the last 4 slides I will play for you are a rather breathtaking insight into what may be going on around us that nobody is aware of. And it underscores, in my opinion, it underscores the value of having people like me, like a lot of others at this conference, who just sit around and think about UFOs, trying to figure out what they're doing, whether they're here or not. After this presentation, I hope you will have a better feeling for that question. Well, I have about 148 slides to get through, 152 if I get to the final coincidence that I'd like to present to you. So I'm going to go through a lot of this very quickly. That's the book that Jerry and Forrest talked about. This is actually 2 books. The Incident at Exeter, that is the incident that caused me to write that article. This is from the 13th of September, 1965. I just graduated from high school. In fact, that really is Peter B. Davenport. That's about a 1962 photograph. But this was the incident that I reported about, a very, very dramatic sighting. Well, let me describe what I'm going to try to do. For the first third or half of my presentation, I'm going to present to you some of the most dramatic sightings that have been reported to me and to the National UFO Reporting Center over the last 21 years, and even going back further than that. Last time, some of you who were here, you will note that I touched on these 4 cases, and I'm going to go through those very quickly. And I got to the Phoenix Lights event, and I ran out of time. I had a 90-minute span 4 years ago, and I got to the Phoenix Lights at 85 minutes into that 90 minutes. So I'm going to rip through these cases, and then I'm going to talk about the 4 cases that I had prepared that I didn't get to. So I mention that so you're not shocked by how fast I'm going through these slides. And you may say, actually, Jerry said I have 90,000 cases. There are really 105,988 cases in my database. I have that database with me, and I know that because I looked at the number just before I left Eastern Washington on Thursday morning. And about 90% of those are posted to our website. The others are hoaxes and frivolous reports and really not worth posting at all. But you may wonder, how did I distill 106,000 cases down to 8 or so? And these are the criteria I use. I am a scientist. For me, the only thing that counts is data, not opinion, not long-winded descriptions, not assurances. None of that matters to me. What I want to know is, did you get a photograph? Are there multiple witnesses, and so on? Well, the criteria I used are, was it a dramatic event? Were there multiple independent witnesses? Were all the witnesses recounting the same thing? Do we have objective evidence like photographs or video? And that's going to be the closing portion of my show. And was an investigation conducted subsequent to the sighting or the event? Those are the criteria I've used to winnow down 106,000 cases down to 8. Now, if I get through those 8 cases, then the second major subject I'm going to be talking about is a phenomenon that started just 3 years ago this month. If probably many of you have heard me on radio, Jeff Rentz, or the Coast to Coast program. You've heard me talk about those red fireballs. If I talk about them anymore, I think George Norrie is going to fire me. But it is the most compelling, most frequent phenomenon that is taking place in the reports that come to me on a regular basis. Then, and I've highlighted this in red, whereas my discussion of the cases may be the most entertaining for you, it is by no means, in my opinion, the most important. What you don't or may not understand is the question of whether UFOs are visiting our planet or not has been resolved, and you don't know it yet. I'm going to show you what the system is that will start giving us really objective data, that will take away, will wrest from the claws of our government the monopoly of information about the UFO phenomenon. I've been talking about this for 20 years, and I haven't seemed to catch people's attention, but I've prepared an all-new presentation about it. I'll have a few concluding remarks, and I'll close, if I get through all of this, with a few concluding remarks about a most amazing coincidence. I hope you enjoy it if I get there. And then we'll have Q&A. Well, a few questions I always am struggling with, and they're questions that UFO investigators like me have to resolve. And they are, as you see before you, first of all, do astronomers see UFOs? Well, I have a few slides here that will introduce you to the evidence that suggests they do. Also, does the government know about UFOs? Clearly they do. I suspect if we were to take a poll in this room, we would have, maybe even by acclamation, unanimity. The answer to that question is yes. Do we ever capture good photographs? Well, if I have time, I'll show you some interesting video. Do UFOs ever have mechanical malfunctions? Roswell is pretty good evidence of that, isn't it? I have another case that I presented 4 years ago. I'm going to go into it in a little greater depth. And if UFOs are real objects, how long have they been coming here? And then I'm going to, throughout this, I have 4 coincidences that have occurred in ufology that I think I have detected, and I'm going to share them with you. Well, this is a very interesting article, June 1960. This is a NASA published article written by Dr. John O'Keefe about an incident that occurred over Toronto, Ontario, February 9th, 1913, before the First World War. And a group of astronomers were outside at a barbecue, if they had barbecues in 1913. They were outside at night, and you can tell it's night because there is Orion, the 3 stars that form the belt of Orion, and that constellation is visible principally during the winter months. They saw groups of fireballs move across the sky very, very slowly. And it was so dramatic an event that one of those astronomers, the chairman of the astronomy department at the University of Toronto, did a painting. I had the pleasure of speaking in Toronto, Ontario last October. I was invited to join George Norrie there. And I proposed to the Canadian audience that they should petition the United States for being the country where the first well-documented UFO sighting took place, because this is every bit as dramatic as the sighting by Ken Arnold June 24th, 1947, when he was flying over the Cascade Mountains. Well, that's a little bigger picture of what the painting looks like, but those astronomers saw 1, 2, 3, and then many clusters of lights that moved across the night sky in unwavering formation, and each one of them was visible for about 2 minutes or so. So they were not meteors. They were, in 1913, they were not satellites. They were not aircraft with blinking lights on them, and so on and so forth. Very interesting article. There's more of it, February 9th, 1913, Toronto, Ontario. Well, on the subject of astronomers, NASA says, oh, those UFO investigators are crazy people. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, if that's the case, why did NASA publish a very interesting document in July of 1968, a year before we first walked on the moon? It's technical report number 277, published by NASA. You can see the NASA logo up there. And it was written or edited by Mrs. Barbara M. Middlehurst, who was a very sophisticated light astronomer, very experienced at Flagstaff, Arizona. Her husband, also a light astronomer, that is, people who gaze through telescopes, he was a very well-known astronomer, and she was commissioned to write this document. They went through 600 years of some of the world's leading light astronomers' handwritten notes. Good scientists keep notes, of course. And they were looking for anything unusual about these people's observation of the moon. Could anything be going on up there that these astronomers had discovered hundreds of years ago? They thought they were going to find nothing. They found about 8,000 entries in those astronomers' handwritten notes that made them suspicious as to whether something had taken place on the moon or not. Well, the other question is, how long have UFOs been coming here? Now, many in the state of Washington would say, well, it started with us on June 24th, 1947, but I don't think that's the case. Here is an article out of the Tacoma, Washington newspaper from 1892, I think it's July 2nd, recounting an incident that is very similar to what happened to Travis Walton, except this individual who was rendered unconscious for 30 minutes with a blast of light that shot out of an object that looked like a cigar tube or a sausage. And it blew the man back onto the beach, and he lay there unconscious while his friends and his fellow fishermen were tending to him, trying to resuscitate him. And here's part of that same article. It said, flashes of light and terrible sounds emitted by one in the bay. It was an object that hovered above the salt water of Puget Sound and just hovered there, sending out brilliantly bright, blindingly bright flashes of light and loud sounds. Well, we can go back even farther. This is an ancient Chinese text. The difference between ancient text and modern Chinese is that there are no dictionaries for ancient Chinese texts. So this was given to me by my handball opponent at the University of Washington, Dr. David Konectes. He's PhD in Oriental languages. He was the chairman of the Department of Chinese Language at the University of Washington. He came up to me on the handball court and he said, Peter, I don't believe in UFOs. That's not my field. He said, however, in the course of my translating this huge document in ancient Chinese, I ran across this and I translated it, and it smacks of a UFO sighting. Now, for those of you who are scientific and prefer primary sources, here's the Chinese. And if you'd like to translate it and send me a copy, we will credit you and we will post it. Well, we find strange paintings on the walls of caves and elsewhere, and it suggests to me, you may have your own opinion, that this phenomenon has been taking place for a long, long time. And we, as a species, are only just beginning to awaken to the fact that we have been visited for a long time. How these people view us, what the relationship between them and us is the only remaining question. And it goes back even further. Here's a cave painting, I think, from Italy. Yes, Val Camonica, Italy, estimated to have been 10,000 years ago. The only remaining question is, could the UFO phenomenon go back hundreds of millions or perhaps billions of years? Well, another question about the government is, do they know about it? And if so, what are they doing about it? Well, they certainly know enough about it to have published this book, The Fire Officer's Guide to Disaster Control, published by the federal U.S. government. And if you turn to, of course it's chapter 13. What other number could it be? This happens all the time. I was once interviewed by Dan Rather on CBS News. Anybody care to guess the date? April 1st. April Fool's Day. But here's a description of the celebrated sighting over Los Angeles, February 26, 1942. They fired, I think they say, 1,433 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition at a disc that hovered over Los Angeles that night, that morning. Very interesting case. And I've actually talked to people who were personal witness his name was Roy Dayton, who lived, or Drayton, who lived in Los Angeles as a boy, and he witnessed all of this, so I'm sure it took place. Well, do astronomers see UFOs? I presume I've satisfied you to some degree that they do see UFOs, or they take them seriously in any event. Does the US government know about UFOs? They published that NASA document and that firefighter's manual. That suggests to me they know fully well, and they are not, in occasional circumstances in the past and in fits of pique, I've probably accused that government of lying to us. Pretty strong language. I think it is more correct to say that for now about 67, 68 years, they have been shielding the American people from information that they should be sharing with us. That is a more correct statement. Do UFOs have malfunctions? Well, once in a while they do. I'll share a case about that. And how long have they been coming? Well, we've answered several of those 5 questions. This is an event that occurred over McMinnville, Tennessee in January of 1995. I had just taken over the hotline 5 months earlier. I was still pretty naive about this. I had to train myself how to run a UFO hotline. I'd never done it before. And even 5 months into it, I was a little naive. I got a call one Saturday night from the Tennessee Emergency Management Administration or Agency, TEMA, and they said, this is Officer so-and-so, we have been directed to you by the U.S. Air Force. He went on to say that we just had a UFO blow up over McMinnville, Tennessee. And the Air Force, we called the Air Force to see what we do, and they told us that the people to call is the National UFO Reporting Center. TEMA thought that was a federal agency, super secret. I don't like to mislead people, and I assured them that we were an independent organization, independent of government, and they sent me this document, faxed to me on January 8th, 1995, about an incident that occurred there, and I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. This is a deputy sheriff's handwritten notes detailing what had happened. I'm going to summarize quickly. People from all around the airport in McMinnville, Tennessee, in Warren County, I think it is, saw a group of objects, extremely bright, cobalt blue, descending slowly over the airport. Suddenly, for reasons not known to me or perhaps to anybody else, one of those objects exploded like a hand grenade, and it sent big shards of blue, cobalt blue fragments high in the sky that cascaded down all over McMinnville. Within 90 minutes, I am told by a private investigator, there were people in that area knocking on people's doors at midnight in a rural area of Tennessee. That's not the type of thing I'd like to do, frankly, and requested permission to go on their property and search for fragments of an airplane that had blown up over McMinnville, Tennessee. This is the deputy sheriff's hand-drawn map. People were at these points on the circumference of that circle. Very interesting case. So we've answered, I think, all but one of the questions. Do we ever capture good photographs? Well, that leads me into some of the cases I'm going to talk about. The first 4 cases I'm going to go through very, very quickly because, first of all, you've seen them. Many of you have seen them before, and I always like to bring new, fresh, interesting information to my audiences, so I don't like to dwell on cases that I've already presented before many of you. This is a very interesting case. December 29th, 1994. I got a call from a woman who lives in eastern Washington, not far from where I live there now. I'm about 50 miles west of Spokane, and she was terrified. In fact, when she called me, she apprised me that she was never going to go outside after dark ever again by herself. She was driving on this road, Zaring Cross Road, going to the north, and her kids said, "Mummy, Mummy, what are those lights out in the wheat field?" Those looked like something unusual, and she glanced over as she was driving. She had 6 kids in her car, 6 of her 7 kids. And she thought they were lights on an 18-wheeler, except it's December 29th, and there are no 18-wheelers in wheat fields on December 29th in eastern Washington. It's usually 2 or 3 feet deep in snow. And she looked back, and long story short, she saw 3 objects that looked like that. I'll show you a little better picture. This is her car. This is her drawing. She stopped her car, rolled down the window, and these objects went directly over her car and in front of her car, and she got a very good look at them. One of them was no farther away than the back of this auditorium is from me. And they went by very slowly, and she, because she had rolled her window down, she could hear the whining coming from one of them. She said it was a strange, strange sound. Very interesting case, and that is her rendition of what it looked like. And that is the mother's drawing of what one of the craft looks like, and this is her daughter's drawing showing the 3 objects. Very interesting case. What are those? I don't think they're drones. I don't think they're weather balloons. I don't think they're crash dummies or swamp gas. Very interesting case. Second case, Pennsylvania Fireball, and I focused and dwelled on this case 4 years ago. One of the most interesting cases I have, and I may be able to show a little video if I go through it quickly. The best UFO video I believe I've ever seen. I'm going to try to show it. A large round fireball streaked over Ontario, apparently over Lake Erie, headed south. It passed into the western end of the state of Pennsylvania, and then it stopped. Let me show you what it looked like. Well, let me play a video, and I'm going to direct you a little bit. What you will see is a perfectly round object. Your first impression will be, well, that's a full moon. But it's not the moon, and it's strobing, and it's moving away from the camera. There was a television news team from Windsor, Ontario, that was out in the field that night doing an investigation, and the camera operator had the presence of mind to hit the start button and capture this thing with his television-grade video camcorder. The only reason I have this video is thanks to Mrs. Amy A. Bear from Texas, a UFO investigator. She called me 3 years after this incident, and she said, "Peter, did you ever get a report about a strange fireball in western Pennsylvania?" And I knew immediately what she was talking about, and I gave her the proper date, and she said, "Yeah, that's it." She said, "What do you think of the video?" And I said, "Video? You got video? What part of my body do I have to donate to your cause to get that video?" She said, "Oh, I'll just send you a copy." Let me play the video. Some of you may remember this video. This is very, very interesting. And when you see the round fireball, look down at the 530 position below it, and you tell me after this video has played what you see there. Here we go.
Residents from Canada to Michigan, as well as some scientists, fired up. John Calplant reports it might have been a meteor shower.
Nothing but a charred skeleton remains of the burned-out mobile home, but it's managed to draw crowds of curious onlookers, the media, and scientists, because of early reports that the blaze was caused by a meteorite. Maddie Jessup is a witness who lives nearby.
I pulled up just after a friend of mine, and she had seen this fireball. She actually saw the fireball, and they followed it right into here. The airport is just about 3/4 of a mile up, and we both thought it was a small aircraft that was coming down. We talked to the Windsor police, and they said somebody had also reported a fireball, so now we're thinking meteorite, you know? Possible, very possible.
We're not precluding that it wasn't something from the sky, and we're not precluding that it wasn't arson. So at this point, we don't know.
Okay, did the fire department from Windsor initially say that it was caused by the meteorite and they had recovered something?
No, I have no reports from the fire department at all in my possession.
A professor and a student from the University of Windsor Earth Sciences Department poked through the debris this morning looking for evidence of a meteorite. They used a special device to detect radiation, but they came up empty-handed.
Okay, what'd you find in there?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no evidence of any meteorite impact. It doesn't rule out that there wasn't one, but there is no evidence of it. If there was one, it was probably a very small, maybe nut-sized or even smaller, that would still provide the kind of a trace that you see in the sky, but when it hits the ground, it doesn't leave much of a trace on the ground.
A local astronomer tells us 100 tons of meteors pass through the atmosphere every day.
What that object did, it started up in Ontario, it apparently crossed Lake Erie, it passed into the western end of Pennsylvania, it got down to Bedford, Pennsylvania, Breezewood, Pennsylvania, and it stopped. And there was a professional race car driver going by on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and suddenly the whole valley that he was in lit up like it was high noon in Needles, California on the 4th of July. He said it was the brightest light he's ever seen. And hovering off to his left was an object that looked like a blue ball with a black ring around its equator and a black ring at the southern pole. Very interesting case. Well, I'm going to accelerate a little bit. Here's another astronomer report. This gentleman saw that object from 250 miles away from New York City, and he submitted a written report. He identifies himself as a PhD in physics and cosmology and astronomy, and the reason I'm inclined to accept his self-description is because it took him 14 months to get the written report submitted. Typical PhD. Thank you, Lord, for sparing me from PhD-dom. I never got one. Tempted, but I never got one. Anyway, this is his description of the object. He said it was one of the brightest objects he's ever seen in our atmosphere. Again, that's what the flight path looked like, and people all along this flight line reported it, and they all said the same thing. It was blue, and it was going from north to south, and then we have the report that it had stopped. A very interesting case, and that's a little better description so you can see it better, or better illustration of what it looked like. Well, there was another case from New Mexico. I call it the New Mexico flash case. It was a Sunday night. It was the 15th of August, 1999, and a flash of light occurred over the southwestern United States that in many parts people reported that it just lit up the entire area around them, again, like the high noon on the 4th of July. And that flash was reported to our center from as far south as Mexico and as far north as Montana. And then, and this is what makes it interesting, and this is what makes me disagree with the Sandia astronomers who say, oh, Mr. Davenport is one of those loony UFO nuts. It happened 21 minutes later over Arizona. A very, very interesting event. And I indicate that fact here. It was captured with sky cameras all over the southwestern United States. These are devices built by Sandia National Laboratories and given to astronomers to record what happens in their sky 24 hours a day. It's a little difficult to see here, but there's a polyvinyl tube up here, and it has a camcorder in this that looks straight down on this hemispherical mirror. So if anything moves across the sky, day or night, its image will be reflected off of this hemispherical mirror, and the camera up here will see an image like this, and it caught this event. Let me play for you one audio clip of what Mr. Jake Hottle is his name. I can reveal his name because he's gone public about this. What he described, this is shortly after the incident occurred. Let's see. No, maybe I won't. I think I took the audio out of this. I apologize, but these are video frames separated by one another by a 30th of a second. A video camera takes 30 frames a second, and this is why you can capture movement. And these are still frames taken from that video, and this shows you what occurred. An immense flash. It was about 60 or 80 miles west of Albuquerque, and it illuminated Sandia Mountain on the east side of Albuquerque so brightly that it blanked out cameras. It was so bright as a reflected image that it blanked out cameras altogether, and it overmodulated the camera is the technical term, I believe. Case number 4, and this is about where I got cut off 4 years ago. So I'm going to reintroduce you to the Phoenix Lights case. In my opinion, the most dramatic event, UFO-related event that has occurred in modern ufology. Is there anybody in the room who has not heard about the Phoenix Lights? Anybody? I'm not surprised. We have one. Okay. I'll touch on it briefly, but the interesting thing is that this object was intercepted over Camelback Mountain. Just yesterday, I flew through Phoenix, and I was at the Phoenix Airport, Sky Harbor Airport, looking north to Camelback Mountain. An object came right over Camelback Mountain, and that is precisely where it was intercepted by 2 F-15 fighters that I think earlier that day had chaperoned President Clinton down to Florida, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. It's the second coincidence that I'd like to touch on. This is one of the early reports I received from a gentleman in Henderson, Nevada, which is on the southeastern corner of Las Vegas. It's a bedroom community for Las Vegas. And that was his sighting. Here's another handwritten report. This is a little bit before the days of the internet, before the internet had come online fully. So I asked people to send a handwritten description, a map, and so on and so forth. And these are some of the reports that I got. This is my worksheet from that night. You see Thursday night, the 13th of March, 1997, at 1922 hours, that was my first call. In Arizona, that was 8:22, because at that time there was a 1-hour difference between the West Coast and Arizona. This is a police officer called me, a retired police officer, and he was just driving out of his neighborhood, and he saw lights that looked something like that to the west of him, and it was so dramatic that it induced him to turn his SUV around and go back to his house to protect his family. That was his immediate reaction. It was so dramatic. And people have provided us with many images. The bottom line is, that night, not fewer, we believe, not fewer than 5 objects, each of which was that large in the night sky as they passed over Phoenix. People described that they subtended an arc above their head equal to about 135 degrees of arc. And these are the same objects that the U.S. Air Force, within hours or days, was trying to convince the American people were nothing but flares that had been launched over the Gila Men firing range 80 miles to the southwest of Phoenix. Nothing could be further from the truth. That's what Robert and Barbara Lee saw as it went over their head north of Phoenix. People did all sorts of things to try to illustrate, at my request, what it really looked like. And one guy used black paper and white ink to simulate accurately what they looked like. And you can see that each one of the lights had, in fact, 3 separate lights to it when this gentleman was looking at them. There's yet another illustration of what a person saw, and he shows multiple lights along the leading edge. Well, this is what it looked like, one of the 5 objects looked like when it passed over Camelback Mountain. This is an artist's rendition taken from the witness's hand drawing, which she faxed to me on the 16th of March, 1997. Mrs. Susan Watson has 7 children. 4 of her children were home, 2 daughters, 2 sons. This is about 20:23 or 20:24 hours, 8:24 at night. And Mrs. Watson was buttoning up her house. She was taking her children to an Irish music concert in preparation for St. Patrick's Day. And she was in the house turning lights off, buttoning up, locking doors, and so on and so forth. And her 4 children started screaming out in the front yard, "Mommy, Mommy, come quickly." And she raced outside expecting to see a crashing airliner. This is very close to Sky Harbor Airport, just on the north side of Sky Harbor. And she looked up, and she was not prepared for what she saw hovering above her house and her neighborhood. She saw an object that looked like that. Actually, I keep punching the wrong button. This is what Camelback Mountain looks like as viewed from Sky Harbor Airport. The camera's looking north. You can see the camel's head and the hump and the rump of a kneeling camel. And the object came right over that V in the mountain. And it got directly above Sue Watson's house, and it stopped. And it hovered there, she estimated, her children estimated, for 5 minutes. Her children lay down on the grass and looked up at this marvelous craft. They could see specific details on the ventral surface of that object. And then suddenly it streaked to the south. Would you like to hear what she broadcast, how she described this on the Jeff Rentz program? Let me play that if I can. No? We're having some audio-visual problem. We played this before, gentlemen. I don't know what happened. We may come back to that, and I'll play it. But what she describes is what they saw. And when I had her on the Jeff Rentz program with her children, talking about what they had seen, I asked her, how big did the object look to you to be, Sue, above your head? And I had her hold up her arms and had her two sons, who are pre-engineering students, estimate the angle that her arms formed. And they estimated that it was 135 degrees of arc. That's how big it was above their heads. And we know from another source of information who was in the Air Force that at that moment the object was at least 8,000 feet above their heads. Let me do the trigonometry for you. An object that's that big and is 8,000, that is 1.6 miles above your head, is not less than 7.4 statute miles in width. The object you're looking at is 3 times in width. We estimate, if the information that has come to us is accurate, that's how big it was, 7.4 miles in width. Can we try this?
I went in and I called the airport and news stations and various people like that and could not get anything, but actually I think it was the airport that gave me Peter's number.
Very good. Okay. Go ahead and tell us about it. Tell us what happened.
Well, actually my children had gone out of the house before I did. We were going to a concert that night, and it was a little bit, maybe 20 minutes after 8, I'm not sure, 8:25 or so. And my daughter came running in and said, Mom, you've got to come out of here right now. We've got something coming over Camelback Mountain, which is a landmark in Phoenix, and we live just a mile below it. So I ran outside. At that time, I had 4 children that were outside with me, and we just watched it. It was the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen come over my house, and it came over extremely slow. I mean, it was just kind of coming over this Camelback Mountain, which is, like I say, a landmark with lots of housing on the mountain. Mm-hmm. I live in a pretty populated area, so everybody is watching the same thing that we are. And the kids started laying on their backs on the yard. You know,
they laid down.
Oh, a couple of the 2 boys laid down on their backs in the front yard because it was like magnificent. It was lit with this kind of, I don't know how, I told Peter it was almost a yellowish light like they have in parking lots. And it was almost a boomerang shape. And it was a solid vehicle. It wasn't something that was separate.
It was coming right toward your house.
It was coming right at, very low. It was flying like extremely low. There was absolutely no sound on it. And there were, I can't remember. I think there were 5 bright lights in front. And actually at one point I saw a laser kind of go down. It was really strange. The kids, we all saw different things. But what we were doing was just basically watching at a very, very slow pace this vehicle just flying over.
What a sight. What a sight that I just...
Went right overhead. And it was huge, and there were 5 of them all over the city of Phoenix that night. And there was also a disc that was seen, allegedly, streaking across the city of Phoenix from east to west at very high speed. We don't know what happened that night. I am satisfied that we have no idea where these things came from, but they were not, I'm convinced of it, flares launched over the Gila Bend firing range 80 miles to the southwest of Phoenix. Now, there is some debate among ufologists as to what the lights were seen to the southwest of Phoenix at 10:02 p.m. At 10:02 p.m., it is my opinion, based on the evidence available to me, that this whole incident had completely taken place and it had ended. My suspicion, absent proof, my suspicion is that the U.S. government has package deals on the shelf such that when they have a very dramatic UFO event occur, they quickly grab one of those off the shelf, they order the local Air Force base to launch whatever they have, disperse flares to take people's attention off of what has just occurred. The U.S. government is dedicated to not letting this information get to us. I think that's wrong. If we lived in a totalitarian state like the old Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, where they have totalitarian regimes that make decisions for everybody, well, maybe justified. But we still live in a country where, at least in theory, it is we, the citizens and the voters and the taxpayers, who dictate to our government what they're going to do for us. That is what the political philosophy I subscribe to. I'll bet a lot of you are sympathetic to that, and they owe us this information, good, bad, or indifferent, irrespective of whatever they may know, whatever the future of this may be. Thank you. Whatever this may translate to, they owe us an explanation, at least to the extent that they are aware of the phenomenon. Well, they launched F-15s out of Luke Air Force Base. They came around, they intercepted that object. When the pilots returned to Luke Air Force Base, the lead pilot could not get himself out of the aircraft. His ground crew had to raise the canopy, undo his shoulder, his lap straps and his knee straps, and physically lift him out of the aircraft. And I believe that lieutenant colonel, he will not talk, that lieutenant colonel is one of the officers who had chaperoned the president down to Florida earlier that morning to go golfing with the professional golfer Greg Norman from Australia. You probably recognize the name. And I'll show you a photograph in a moment. Another different looking object went down Interstate 10 from Phoenix down to Tucson to the southeast, and people on the highway, Stacy Rhodes in particular, Mrs. Stacy Rhodes, reported that it was so large when it went over them, slowly, it went to the southeast while they were driving to the northwest, that it completely blocked out all of the stars above their head. They could not see any stars. It covered so much of the sky. And that is Mrs. Rhodes' hand-drawn illustration. She said, the object we saw was much, much larger than is previously described. It was huge. I suspect at least 7 miles in width. And these are the photos or part of the video that was taken a few minutes after 10 p.m. Again, keep in mind, this is about an hour and a half after that object had hovered above Mrs. Susan Watson's home. And I believe that these may be flares launched out of A-10 Warthogs flown by the U.S. Air Force, but I cannot prove it. And this is my telephone log for the 13th of March. The U.S. Air Force had the audacity to report to the American people that they didn't know what people like me, these crazy ufologists, were talking about because their base had not taken a single call all night long. Well, here is my telephone bill, March 13th, it's for 1997, at 10:02 p.m. to Litchfield Park, Arizona, 602-856-7411. Somebody here might try to dial that number because that'll take you to the Luke Air Force Base switchboard. And they told me when I called, they were too busy to talk to me. I'll bet they were busy. Sue Watson also called them. That's where she got my number, the National UFO Reporting Center, 206-722-3000. That's why she called me. That's why you heard her voice. Also, the next morning, March 14th, I made all sorts of calls. Los Angeles, Litchfield Park, Los Angeles, Deer Valley, Arizona, trying to find out what had happened. All I knew that Friday morning was that I had been buried with information. Calls, I must have taken 100 calls in 8 hours or less. It was a very dramatic night. Anyway, very few articles. This is the first article I'm aware of from the Daily Courier in Prescott Valley, I believe it is, written by Laura Hinchy. If she were here, I would have her come up on this platform and I would give her a big hug because she was dedicated. She knew as a journalist that something unusual had happened. This is another article. Here's another coincidence. I think this is the second or third coincidence I've presented to you, and there are a couple more. Within seconds of the interception of that object over Sue Watson's home, U.S. military forces, we believe, I cannot prove it, but we have good, strong evidence from general officers who assure me personally that they knew fully well about the Phoenix Lights. They'd raised U.S. military forces from Defense Condition 5, skipping 4 altogether straight to Defense Condition 3. And concomitant to that, within minutes certainly, possibly within seconds of that, the President of the United States, who was overnighting at the home of Greg Norman, the golfer, the President had been flown from Washington, D.C. down to Orlando, Florida, played golf all day long with Greg Norman, and he was allegedly standing outside and the ligaments in his knee just gave way. He had to be spirited back to Washington, D.C. For emergency surgery. And this is a photograph of the President lying in a hospital bed with what is reputed to be his wife standing next to him. As far as I know, it was. I have no reason to doubt whatsoever. And one of two things, either the President was injured, and I suspect if that's the case, he was injured because he was being raced to a waiting vehicle. I presume that when a general declares a DEFCON 3, which is one step short of World War, that somebody picks up the phone and lets the commander-in-chief know about it. Under those circumstances, it's important to get the commander-in-chief to a military safe area where his presence is not known, where he's safe, and so on.
He hurt himself.
Pardon?
He hurt his knee going down the steps of Greg Norman's house.
Yeah, we have a comment here. He injured his knee going down the steps at Greg Norman's house, but there are multiple stories, and I think they've gotten their stories mixed up. They've told them so long. As Mark Twain once observed, somebody asked Mark Twain, is there any difference between an honest man and a liar? Took the cigar out of his mouth and he said, no, not really, except the liar has to have a better memory. Well, here's a USA Today article. This is now 13 weeks after the incident had occurred, and finally it breaks into the national press, June 18th, 1997. And the Arizona Republic says it's UFO mania. Well, I'm going to speed up. I've got a few more cases to talk about. Here's another very interesting case, the Bangor submarine case. We had our audiovisual man down here. You may not be able to see him, Tom Dickinson. I met him just last night, 22 and a half years in the U.S. Navy. He was a submarine man. He will enjoy this story in particular. On Wednesday night, April 22nd, 1998, at about 10:20 p.m., an object came out of Canada, headed south. It went over Bangor submarine base. It slowed and stopped over the nuclear weapons storage bunkers at Bangor Sub Base. Then it continued on, and it was last seen by a deputy sheriff in Yakima, Washington, going straight north at high speed, and by the time it had gotten over there, it had changed colors. This distance, this ground track, I estimate to be not less than 500 miles, probably closer to 600 miles. It covered that distance in less than 10 minutes. That's an average velocity of 3,600 miles an hour. And it also included 3 separate stops. It stopped twice here, It slowed over Bangor Sub Base, and it stopped over Interstate 5 just north of Portland, Oregon. Very interesting case. This is my initial attempt to reconstruct that's what it looked like when it went over the nuclear weapons storage bunkers. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I have a special mission and a special subject to present to this audience, but I wanted to cover these incidents. We hear about mutilated animals. This was an animal abduction case, February 25th, 1999. This is one of the cases I ran out of time and didn't get to present to you 4 years ago. Very interesting case. That's what the countryside looks like out west of Mount St. Helens that blew up, as you may remember, in May of 1980. This is Robert Fairfax and I, and the object was over this valley and this sloped area, and that's what it looked like. It was no bigger than the average U.S. automobile, and it actually flew directly towards a herd of elk that panicked except for one animal that started trotting off in a different direction, and that object went right after that elk and picked it up out of the forest and flew off with it. Very interesting case, and we think we found the elk. We think this was the animal. It had perfectly good teeth, it was well fed, it was not sick by any overt signs anyway. Very interesting case. And Bob Fairfax did an article July of 1999 in the UFO Journal. Very interesting. Well, it's not just animals in the forest that UFOs are inclined to abduct. How many have heard about the Todd Seas case? Not very many. Good. Sunday morning, 5 a.m., the 4th of August, 2002. Mr. Todd Seas, age 37, I believe, left his home in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. That's south central Pennsylvania. And he was going up to his family property that had been in his family for many, many generations to scout out populations of deer in preparation for the deer hunting season. And we don't know what happened to him. We don't know what he did during the subsequent 30 minutes, but at 5:30 a.m., 4 adult witnesses, a farmer and 3 fishermen floating down the Susquehanna River, saw a man's body, allegedly, a man's body clad only in undergarments, being floated up slowly in a shaft of light that connected the top of Mount Montour, where Mr. C's property was, to a disc that was hovering above the top of the mountain. The body was seen to reach the disc, and it went into the disc. The disc then jumped a short distance to the west and hovered there for a few moments, and then suddenly shot off to the west faster than the human eye could follow it. Well, that triggered a manhunt, and I'm going to show you some of the photographs, or some of the articles, photographs of the articles about this man's death. They mounted a search party. There were about 200 or 250 people in the search party. They searched for 40 hours. They did not find any trace of Mr. C's except his all-terrain vehicle with his outer clothing neatly folded and stacked on top of the back of his, what do they call those vehicles? I've forgotten, a four-wheeler, essentially. Until Monday, 7:15 p.m., this is the day after he was seen, or at least a man's body was seen being levitated into a saucer, his son was searching around the family home. This is about 3 or 4 miles from where Mr. C's had last been seen. And tragically, his son looked up in heavy underbrush, or perhaps a tree, I don't know which for sure, and saw what he took to be human remains. Police were summoned immediately for reasons that they won't state. As far as I'm aware, they immediately summoned the FBI that came racing to the scene, and they closed off the area. They took Mr. C's remains to a local hospital. He reportedly, one source, one witness only, unfortunately, he had some kind of device clamped to his body. I believe it was his upper arm, looked metallic. Nobody could recognize it or identify it. They took the remains then to the coroner's office, performed an autopsy. Mr. James Kelly, the new coroner of Northumberland County, performed the autopsy. I called him. I said, Coroner Kelly, I'm Peter Davenport. I'm the director of the National UFO Reporting Center. I'm calling about an autopsy that I'm led to believe your office conducted, that of Mr. Todd Sees, and I'm calling to seek information. And he said, well, I'm not able to give you very much, but I'd be happy to talk to you. That conversation lasted for about a minute and a half, and then he said, Mr. Davenport, I'm going to have to terminate this conversation because I have information that I can't give you. And I said, well, were photographs taken of the decedent's remains during the autopsy? He said, yes, but you will never see them. I said, but they're matter of public record. Well, not in this case. So a very interesting case, this case of Todd Sees. And I have, by the way, I failed to mention it, I wrote an article about this case for the MUFON UFO Journal. That's the first page. I have those articles with me if anybody would like to read the details of this case. I did it in 2 parts. It was such an involved case with so much information I wanted to impart to the MUFON readers. So, very interesting case. Well, it's not just animals and human beings. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, was his body released to his family for burial?
Oh, I skipped over an important part of that case. And every one of these cases, I skip over about 99% of what I could share with all of you. I discovered that Mr. Todd Sees' body was returned to the family. They were forbidden from viewing the remains of their family loved one. Very unusual. That's part of the story, and thank you very much for commenting. Also, the remains were returned to the family, I am told. I cannot confirm this, but it comes from a good source, from a nurse. The remains were returned to the family in a metal coffin, the lid of which had been screwed down to the bottom portion of it, and it had been welded around the edges, so they could not get in it. I encouraged the family to initiate proceedings to exhume the body. This was just a few weeks after, and take a look at the body. And they accused me of being a rabble-rouser and one of those kooks and so on. Good heavens, is anybody thinking clearly in this country anymore? Anyway, very interesting case. Case of the mutilated car. I'm going to speed up here. November 4th, 2008. I mentioned that date, and ruminate on that date for a moment and ask yourself what other momentous event occurred on this date. This is what the car looked like, and the whole left side of it had been puckered in like a vacuum bag. A young woman was driving her late model Japanese 4-door sedan close in Chicago. She was going to her boyfriend's house to, she said, study, and she was driving along a secondary 3-lane road, and suddenly her car was shifted 1 lane to the right, or pushed in any event. You can read her report on our website for this date. And she was so alarmed by what had happened that she stopped her car at the first opportunity. Within a block, she stopped her car and got out and surveyed the left side of her car, and this is what she saw. A brand new car. Her mother had just purchased it for her as a freshman university student gift. I wish I'd gotten such a nice gift as a freshman. I was lucky to pass freshman year. But this is what it looked like. There are no scuffs. There's no scuffed paint. You can see that's the car ahead. You can see some gray here. That's a motorcycle parked over to the left that is being reflected in that shiny paint. That's what the car looks like. Now, during Q&A, I ask you to ruminate on this for a little bit, and if anybody can explain to me how somebody could do that to a car, I would like to hear about it. Force field is the comment. We'll talk about that if we have time. I did an article in the MUFON Journal. I have that article with me. I might be able to make copies for anybody who'd does not subscribe to it and would like to see it. Okay. Second part of my talk, and I'm going to go through very quickly. How many of you have heard me on George Norrie's program, Coast to Coast, talk about these fireballs, red, orange, yellow fireballs? Good, a lot of you. I'm going to give you about a 5-minute rendition of what I have seen from my vantage point. The phenomenon started 3 years ago this month, April of 2012, and I have absolutely no explanation for what's going on. These things concern me. They should not be there. I hold a commercial pilot's license, have held it since October 77, former flight instructor. I know generally which end of the airplane is supposed to point forward. And these objects, I believe, are not from our planet. This is the second page of that article I did for, again, the MUFON Journal, and my gratitude to Roger Marsh and to Jan Harzan. Roger Marsh, the editor of this monthly journal, and Jan for allowing me to bring these articles and make photocopies for anybody who'd like them. This is Helsinki, April 29th, 2012. This is typical of what is reported to me. Red, orange, or yellow fireballs in a cluster, sometimes up to 150 or 200 in a cluster. Have no idea what they are. Sometimes one or more of them will suddenly streak off and go over the horizon. And there are people who are trying to convince me that these are nothing but Chinese lanterns. There's Helsinki again. Very interesting case, and I've written 3 or 4 articles for the MUFON Journal about it, trying to get people's attention. I've actually shared these cases on UFO forums, and I've been roundly shouted down and criticized as that kook who believes in UFOs. These are UFO people talking. There's an article. This was an event that occurred on November 12th, 2012. And I'm going to rapidly play a few of the slides. This is Seattle, the 4th of July last year. If you want to see something very interesting, go to the reports for the 4th of July of last year, 2013, 2012, 2011, 2010, and so on. I believe that we're dealing with creatures, this is a tall statement, who recognize how difficult it would be for somebody like me to convince the American public that UFOs are making appearances on 4th of July. What else? What other bright lights are people going to see? But I think they understand us well enough to be able to know that they can make an appearance on the 4th of July and nobody's going to believe somebody like me. There they are. Now, a lot of people are trying to convince me, again, that these are Chinese lanterns. I'm going to show you what Chinese lanterns look like in just a moment. That's what a Chinese lantern looks like. Let's compare that and that. I do get a few cases, a few reports of what I think are Chinese lanterns. People find the burned remains, but I also believe, and I wish I had another hour to share with you some of the interesting disinformation that has been fed to me that I believe must come from the US government. It's very interesting. That's what a mass sighting or mass release of Chinese lanterns looks like. Could we play this? This is China, 11-second video, very interesting. I'm going to play a recent video and tell me if these are Chinese lanterns. Notice this object is strobing with a red light and it has 2 green lights. That is not an aircraft, I believe, from our planet. This is very interesting video. Well, that leads me to a few final slides. I've done articles on the one place in the world that I think is a hotspot. You know, many people talk about UFO hotspots. I see none, except for Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. That's right on the very easternmost tip of South Carolina, and I'm going to have to go through slides very quickly. This is an incident that occurred in my home state, Washington State, San Juan Island, the city of Friday Harbor, on the 15th of June this year at 6:15 p.m. This gentleman is a seasoned pilot. He's a retired architect, an excellent, excellent witness. And the local newspapers there did an article about it. I urged him to go to the newspaper, and he did, and they did a very nice article, and that article went around the world. You may have seen it. Okay. I'm sorry I don't have more time to dwell on a lot of those slides, but I'm going to take 5 or 10 minutes of your time if I have that much time remaining. Do I? I'm assured I do. This is the most important part of my presentation. And this is the message that I hope you walk out the door with today, because this is very important. Just over 20 years ago, I had been running the hotline for about 5 months, and I was panicked. The workload is like something you can't imagine. I work 2 shifts, or am on call for 2 shifts a day, 7 days a week. That's what you have to do when you run a hotline, UFO hotline or any other kind. And I was panicked. When I had taken over the job from the founder of the hotline, Robert Gribble, I said to myself, well, how many calls can there be after all? 1, 2, maybe 3 a week? That's not many. I can handle that. Within a week or 10 days, I was taking 1, 2, or 3 dozen calls per day. And I was panicked. It's like pulling your finger out of the dike and suddenly the water comes streaming at you. And I said, there's got to be a better way to detect UFOs than taking eyewitness accounts or fuzzy photographs. A lot of fuzzy photographs. 99% of the photos sent to me are not of allegedly of UFOs. I don't think are definitely UFOs. Well, let me talk about an idea that hit me. I can tell you exactly the day. It was the afternoon of, it was about January 29th or 30th, the Friday before Martin Luther King weekend, 1995. My younger days, I used to work in the venture investment industry for a short period of time. And one of the companies that came to our company looking for investment capital was a company called Meteor Communications Corporation. They were founded about 1970 when the Boeing crash occurred in Seattle. There was a vast reduction in the sale of aircraft, and Boeing was on the ropes financially. A group of scientists from Boeing split off, and they set up a company called Meteor Communications Corporation. They realized that because when a meteor streaks through the atmosphere of the planet Earth, it creates a tube of ionized gas, and you can bounce a radio signal off that tube of ionized gas and skip it about 1,200 miles. So it's a means of communication. And this company created that technology, and they came to our company. Their equipment had become obsolescent, and they were short of funds, and they were looking for an investment infusion. And it suddenly occurred to me, if they have equipment that can detect an ionized trail in the atmosphere, is there any reason that this equipment could not detect something else? Let's call it an anomalous target for now. As long as it reflects radio waves, we should be able to detect it, right? Does that make sense? Well, I met with the scientists at Meteor Communication Corporation to confirm my suspicions, and they said, no problem there. If it reflects a radio wave, you're going to be able to detect it under the proper circumstances. This is some advertisement that I obtained from Meteor Communication Corporation. You see here, meteor burst communication. This is different types of communication technology. One of them is a meteor burst, where you send a radio signal, bounce it off a tube of ionized gas. They dwell there for anywhere from 1 to 5 seconds. So you got to be pretty quick, but you can communicate a lot of information very quickly. And this documents, you may not be able to see the date. This is April 25th, 1995, Meteor Communication Corporation, with a lot of handwritten doodles. I've had many, many conversations with scientists about this, and to the man and woman, they say, it'll work. Well, I wrote in November of 1999, I believe it was, I wrote an article. This was the 30th anniversary issue of the MUFON Journal. I didn't even know what passive radar was. I called it meteor scatter. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button again. I called it meteor scatter communications technology, a concept. And I'm proposing in this article to the UFO community that we can get away from eyewitness accounts. There's nobody in this room who wants to get away from eyewitnesses to UFOs stronger than I do, I assure you. I said, we can do something better than eyewitness accounts and fuzzy photographs, and this is what I proposed. And I wrote this article. It was 12 weeks before I got a response from any of the MUFON readers, MUFON Journal readers, before any of them said, wait a minute, Peter, you're proposing a system that will allow us to detect UFOs directly. I said, yeah, that's what I wrote. And underscoring the very real nature of passive radar, and I'm going to describe to you in a moment what passive radar is. This is dated 1970. This is a top secret worksheet for the defense and intelligence communities from 1970. And this is, I took this off the internet. This is a passive radar seminar given at the Applied Physics Laboratory at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. I was not invited to this. It required a top secret security clearance. I used to have one when I was in the Army, when I was a Russian translator, but they didn't invite me to this. The interesting thing is the organizer, you probably cannot see this from where you are, is Professor John Sarr. I had taken, 6 months earlier, I had taken Professor Sarr's graduate course in radar. And I requested that he become part of a team to build a passive radar system. He said, Peter, I might be able to consult a little bit, but I don't think I really want to become affiliated with it. And then from this, I discovered that he has a top secret security clearance. He works for the Air Force. He works for the security intelligence forces of our country. Well, this is what passive radar is. It has no transmitter. It's just a listening device. It's no more sophisticated than the receiver in your automobile. If in Seattle, for example, we have, in Yakima, I'm going to go to Yakima, Washington, we have a radio or television station that is broadcasting a signal. Ironically, when George Norrie broadcasts, he broadcasts over 500 or 600 of the most powerful AM stations in the country. And that would be a very good carrier for detecting UFOs. If there is something up above this transmitter, under ordinary circumstances, a receiver on the other side of these mountains will not be able to hear this transmitted signal unless there's something above that reflects the signal off of it down to the receiver. Does that make sense? I've left a lot of people in the dust on this. This is about as simple as I can make it. In fact, the US Navy ran one of these systems starting in the late 1950s, and they never told the American people what they were capturing with their passive radar system. This is Lake Kickapoo, Texas. This system ran for about 40 years. They shut it down at the end of October 2013, just a year and a half ago. This is their antenna. Let me go back. They have a big, long antenna that radiates a fan of radio information, radio data, radio signal out into the atmosphere, and whenever a satellite passed through that fan of radio waves, it would reflect a signal back down to the ground. And the Navy had receivers all across the United States that would listen for that reflected signal. Well, I have a few graphics that I'm going to end with. This is what a passive radar system looks like. You have a transmitter on one side of the mountains. If there happens to be an anomalous target, let's say a disc, an airplane, a flock of geese, it will reflect that signal back down to ground level. And if you have an array of antennas, what it allows you to do, here's an array of antennas. They only have to be a couple hundred meters apart to be able to get accurate data. You can then triangulate on where the source of the reflected radio signal is, and then you can do that 10 or 100 times a second, and you can track the motion of an object across the sky, and then you start applying discrimination. If it's doing 450 miles an hour at 37,000 feet, it's an airplane. If it's at 10,000 feet and it's doing 35 miles an hour, it's probably a flock of geese. If it's doing 20,000 miles a second at 50 miles above the surface, then you have something very interesting. Anyway, this is what the signals would look like plotted over time, the signal voltage. This is a billionth of a second, but we could not have done this 20 years ago. But it is now within our capability, the UFO community, to build a system of passive radar detectors that will allow us to sit at a computer and watch UFOs coursing above the surface of the planet, as far out as the orbit of the Earth's moon. That is what I propose. Now you say, this is pie in the sky, or should I say pie tin or pie plate, to be fully consistent, being a UFO investigator. These systems exist. This is a passive radar system, passive radar system built by a German company. Now you say, and I think this costs between $20 and $30 million for this unit. And you say, well, people, that's not a lot of money. We can just go to all UFO investigators and we can buy one. The problem is US federal law forbids any one of us from owning or buying this unit. And I see the white cane assembled. Anyway, I show you these slides to emphasize and underscore the fact that it is now within the capability of us UFO investigators, if we get about between $250,000 and $750,000, our engineering team estimates, we will be able to build one of these systems and make hotlines obsolete. And that's what I want to see, is obsolete hotlines. Well, let me close. This is what my system will look like, a lot simpler than that commercially available system. And people have been doing this for a long time. That is the Echo satellite, and they used to bounce signals from Washington, D.C. to Hawaii off that satellite, and they had direct communications. So I'm not the first to recognize that you can bounce signals, and we could cover the entire North American continent with, I estimate, 6 stations. Each one costs about $5,000 to $10,000 for a computer, a receiver, antennas, cable, everything. Anyway, that is my greatest contribution to the field of ufology. In fact, I think it's my greatest academic contribution to the planet Earth. And the UFO phenomenon started in Washington State. I would like to build one of at least that's the standard operating story. I would like to end the story in Washington State by building one of these systems. Last, I can do this in 30 seconds. I know I'm over. This is an interesting document, the Skoroton Mystery. On the 24th of April, 1965, the day after George Adamski died, a gentleman whose name is Ernest Bryant was approached by a disc in Skoroton, England. This is where the coincidence comes in. He was told it would come back a month hence. It did. He was told at that second meeting it would come back a third time, but it did not. And I will close with this. This is where Skoroton, England is, close to Hampshire, England. This is England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, of course. And this is where it all took place. When the disc was supposed to have come back in June of 1965, it disappeared, never came back. That is when sightings started appearing in southeastern New Hampshire, and that was the incident at Exeter. These were the beginning sightings that led up to the incident at Exeter. And here's where it's interesting, and this woke me out of a sound sleep in 1991. It started in England, near Hampshire, near the cities of Portsmouth and Exeter, and the saucer never came back. When it was supposed to have come back, saucers started appearing near Exeter, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in New England. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm way over time. I am delighted by your presence here. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.